A police officer boldly stopped a black American general's car, suspecting there was a safe in his trunk. He insisted on opening the safe, but with one small slip-up. Boom! A bright green paint splashed straight into his face, turning him into a moving traffic cone, his entire body covered in paint. Sounds like a bad day, right? But trust me, that's just the beginning. From here, things are going to get even crazier, and you won't believe what happens next. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. The sun had just risen above the horizon, casting a soft golden light over everything, making the morning air feel fresh and crisp. Fluffy clouds floated lazily in the sky, and a gentle breeze swept across the wide fields along the highway. Everything seemed to be at peace, like the world was holding its breath in quiet stillness. It was a morning without the blare of car horns or the hustle of the city, just the hum of an engine smoothly gliding along an empty freeway. James Cooper, a 52-year-old man who had just retired from the military after 30 years of service, was driving his black SUV at a leisurely pace, enjoying the rare tranquility that long drives often bring. Dressed casually in a light blue shirt and jeans, he looked like an ordinary man, nothing out of the ordinary. But if anyone looked closely, they would notice the sharpness in his gaze, calm and resolute. It was the look of someone who had endured countless trials, hardships, and battles in his years of service under the flag of his country. A lifetime in the military had made James strong and steady. Even though he had retired and returned to civilian life, he could never fully escape his past. It was part of who he was, an inseparable part of him that quietly existed, no matter how hard he tried to live a simple, quiet life. On long nights, when there were no wars or missions, he still remembered the tense, brutal days, the decisions he had to make, the comrades who had fallen, and the encounters that could never be forgotten. But this morning, there was nothing to worry about. James felt at ease driving down the empty freeway, a place where no one would disturb him. Everything was calm, as if time had stopped. The car glided smoothly, the engine's steady hum echoing in the vast space. The feeling of the breeze through the window was freedom. Only those who have fought and sacrificed could truly understand. James took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air, telling himself that after everything he had been through, he was finally able to live for himself. However, the one thing that made him uneasy was the safe placed neatly on the back seat. Though the safe looked like any other, to James, it held a completely different meaning. It wasn't just a container for important documents in the military, medals he had earned throughout his career, but also a place where memories and secrets were kept, things that could never be exposed. Strategic maps, classified documents from crucial missions, and a recording that could change the course of a war, known only to him. This safe was not just an object for protecting assets. It was a part of James's life, a part he wanted to protect so that no one could touch it. It had been specially designed with an extremely complex security system that could spray a special type of paint, impossible to wipe off if anyone tried to tamper with it. James had spent considerable time and effort safeguarding it, and now, in his SUV, the safe was his treasure, containing values that only he understood. Even though James had taken every precaution, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. What if someone tried to open the safe? Whoever it was would face a security system only someone with military experience like him could design. But he hoped that the safe wouldn't be challenged during this trip. The experience of someone who had witnessed great battles and unpredictable situations kept James always on alert. Although he had left the military, his instincts hadn't changed. and this safe was a symbol of his meticulous preparation in an unpredictable world. Then, as the SUV continued to roll down the quiet road, a thought, a premonition, flashed through James's mind. He couldn't explain why, but something felt off, like something was about to happen. These thoughts weren't new. They were the same feelings he had experienced during his military career when everything could change in an instant. Perhaps it was because of the safe in the back seat, or perhaps there was something else he didn't fully understand. But that gut feeling kept haunting him. At that moment, a red and blue flashing light appeared in the rearview mirror. A faint siren broke the quiet of the morning. James sighed as he looked in the mirror. Nothing unusual, just a police car pulling up behind. But what he didn't expect was that the presence of this car would not be a simple traffic stop. The seemingly peaceful drive had now been interrupted. Although James was certain he hadn't been speeding or committed any violations, the appearance of the police officer made him feel a slight unease, however small. James exhaled, kept his hands steady on the wheel, and pulled over to the side of the road, his mind now filled with doubt. The police car expertly stopped behind his SUV, and immediately Officer Mark Henderson stepped out. Henderson was an imposing figure with impressive height and a muscular build, but his eyes were filled with suspicion, as though he was trying to figure out something was wrong. His expression was stern, with no trace of friendliness, just a sharp focus on James, as though his eyes were searching for something hidden in the man sitting behind the wheel. James had encountered Henderson before, in a rather tense situation. It had been during a military mission when Henderson, then a young officer, had found himself in a difficult situation that led to a clash between the two men. Back then, Henderson had been impatient, even aggressive in dealing with a situation he thought was simple, but didn't fully understand, unlike James. From that moment on, a quiet tension had lingered between them, though they had never directly confronted each other. But today, the look Henderson gave James seemed to carry an evaluation, a quiet suspicion about what James was doing. "Good morning, sir," Henderson spoke, his tone cold. He quickly glanced through the window into James's SUV, but stopped when his eyes landed on the large safe in the back seat. His expression changed immediately, as if a red flag had gone off in his mind. "What's in the safe?" Henderson asked, his voice laced with suspicion, his gaze never leaving the safe. James gently turned to look at the safe, then turned back to meet Henderson's eyes, a polite smile tugging at his lips. "Just personal documents, nothing illegal, I assure you," James replied calmly, but Henderson didn't seem ready to let it go. He took a step closer, even leaning in towards the safe with a seriousness that suggested he was determined to uncover something suspicious. "Personal documents? In a safe this big? Something's not right here." He lowered his voice, his eyes now filled with doubt. "I'm requesting to inspect this safe." James sat still in the car, unfazed. He sensed the tension in the air and realized that Henderson was not an ordinary officer. This feeling was like encountering an old friend who was no longer friendly, only filled with distrust and suspicion. Henderson didn't stop James's car by chance. The suspicion in his eyes wasn't just about the safe. There was another reason, something deeper that James couldn't ignore. Henderson wasn't a stranger to James. The real reason he had stopped the car was because he had heard much about James Cooper from colleagues' reports and unofficial sources. To Henderson, the name James Cooper wasn't just a retired officer. It was a military legend, someone who might be connected to classified documents or secret missions that many still wondered about. The stories of a senior officer with a remarkable past and untold stories from wars had always intrigued people like Henderson, often mixed with curiosity and sometimes jealousy. This made him more decisive and suspicious when facing James. Henderson's gaze shifted between the safe and James, his lips pressed tightly together, clearly showing distrust. "I can't let you go without inspecting the safe. There's something wrong with it," he said, his eyes flashing with determination. James took a deep breath, deciding not to yield. "Officer, I've told you there's nothing illegal. If you want to check it, you need a legal reason." His words were firm, and he could feel the tension in the air like both men were standing on the edge of a cliff, neither willing to take the first step down. Henderson wasn't backing down. He wasn't the type to easily let go, and his suspicious gaze never left James. This confrontation wasn't just about the safe. It was a standoff between two men, one who had been through countless challenges and knew how to keep calm in any situation, and the other, younger and filled with doubts, eager to assert his authority. The air inside the SUV felt thick as Officer Henderson drew closer, his footsteps heavy on the ground like a declaration of war. The sun was rising high, but its light seemed unable to dispel the tension that weighed on the space around them. James did not move, maintaining his calm posture behind the wheel, but in his heart he knew that things were about to change. Every moment of silence now carried a dangerous undertone. Henderson stood right next to the window, his eyes still fixed on the safe, as though he saw a hidden threat within it. "So, you refuse to cooperate?" Henderson said, his tone cold with a hint of mockery. "Do you know that this safe could be a potential danger? It could contain things that no one is allowed to know. Do you think I'm just going to let you go that easily?" James replied slowly, his expression unchanged. "I'm not refusing to cooperate, Officer Henderson. I'm simply asking for a legal reason to open this safe." His voice was firm but still polite, "and I believe that if you can prove such a reason, I won't hesitate." Henderson straightened up, his hands loosely resting on his hips, glaring at James as though he were a suspect in a major case. James's words seemed like a challenge to the doubt Henderson was carrying. This only made Henderson even more tense. "Is that so?" Henderson sneered, his face growing darker. "Well, then I'll find my reason. A man like you, driving this car with that safe? Surely it doesn't just contain a few simple documents. Are you hiding something that could threaten national security? A man who was once a military general, could there be something suspicious?" he said, his tone laced with derision and doubt. James stood his ground. "That's just your imagination, Officer Henderson. I'm sure you don't think I'm hiding anything suspicious just because of a safe, do you?" Henderson had lost his patience. His gaze was now filled with frustration, and perhaps, deep inside, there was an overwhelming, unshakable doubt. The atmosphere between the two men seemed unnatural still, as though the entire world was standing still, waiting for a decisive move. "What's in this safe that you don't want me to see?" Henderson continued, his voice now lacking any semblance of calmness, replaced by mockery and scorn. "I think this is a serious threat. There's something wrong with you, and I'm not letting you go without inspecting it." James took a deep breath, maintaining his calm and resolve. He knew this confrontation would not end easily, but he could not allow himself to be drawn into Henderson's impulsive actions. Henderson took another step toward the safe, his hand gripping a hammer as if ready to use it to break open the safe without a second thought. "This is my property," James said, his voice dropping, carrying a warning. "You have no right to touch it. If you want to continue, I'll ask you to provide a legal search warrant." Henderson stopped, his expression filled with frustration, but the stubbornness in his eyes remained undiminished. "You don't understand, old man. Not everyone can stand on equal footing with me, and I don't have time to argue with you anymore." Henderson's gaze flashed with anger, His impatience had turned into hostility, and James knew that once Henderson had made up his mind, it wouldn't be easy to change it. But he still couldn't back down. He couldn't allow the safe to be violated by a cop with unclear intentions. Henderson moved closer, and it seemed he had run out of patience. He began to raise his hand as if preparing to open the safe without waiting for James's consent. At that moment, James stepped out of the car, standing tall and facing Henderson, his gaze unwavering. "Don't try it," he said, his voice cold but as firm as steel. The confrontation between the two men had now escalated. No longer just an argument about power or legality. Now it had become a test of patience, determination, and pride for both of them. Henderson stood for a moment, his face tense, as if he were thinking about his next move. James could sense this, but he did not back down. The anger and sarcasm in Henderson's eyes became more and more evident, and his impatience pushed the situation to a point of no return. "You don't know who I am, James," Henderson said, his voice dripping with sarcasm and tension. "Not everyone can stand on equal footing with me, and I don't have time to argue with you anymore." James stood firm, his arms crossed over his chest, staring directly into Henderson's eyes. "I won't let you do that," he said calmly. "This is my property, and you have no right to do anything without legal cause." But instead of stopping, Henderson became more determined than ever. He turned and walked quickly to the patrol car, and within seconds he returned with a crowbar, an object no one wanted to see in such a tense situation. "Don't act rashly," James warned, though his voice couldn't fully conceal the anxiety inside. He realized the situation was slipping out of his control. Henderson ignored James's warning, his eyes flashing with determination. "I'm going to make you see, James. You may not want to cooperate, but I'm going to open this safe, whether you agree or not." The scene grew even more tense as Henderson began to force the crowbar into the edge of the safe. The sound of metal scraping seemed to press the air, each noise a challenge to James. Henderson didn't stop, continuing to apply force to pry open the safe, his eyes never leaving it as if it were an enemy that needed to be subdued. But before he could act further, Henderson ordered for backup. The radio crackled, and a few minutes later, another patrol car arrived from a distance. Now, the situation was no longer just a confrontation between two men. It could turn into a siege. James knew that with Henderson's backup, the pressure on him would increase exponentially. However, he didn't back down. During his years in the military, James had faced far more extreme situations. The appearance of his colleagues only boosted Henderson's confidence. A new officer stepped out of the car, holding a baton while another stood behind, still watching the safe. Henderson turned back to look at James, a smile on his face as if he had already won. "So, what now, old man?" Henderson asked, his tone now devoid of patience. "You think you can escape this?" James smirked, a faint smile appearing on his face, but he didn't let the tension affect him. "I told you, Henderson, you don't have the right to do this. If you have something to prove, I'm willing to cooperate. But not like this." With the confidence of someone who had been through countless trials, James took a step forward. Though Henderson was continuing to pry open the safe roughly, James remained unperturbed. He knew that in this situation, only the calmness and authority of a former military leader would help him handle everything. The metallic screech grew louder as Henderson pushed the crowbar deeper into the crack of the safe. However, the safe didn't open immediately. This only made Henderson more frustrated. James remained still, but in his mind, the preparation was complete. With a small gesture of his hand, the phone in his jacket pocket had already recorded the entire event. James said nothing, But every action Henderson made was being captured, and he knew that Henderson's aggressive behavior would serve as vital evidence to clarify everything later. As Henderson continued to push the crowbar forcefully into the safe, he couldn't have known that this safe was not just a regular box of items. In a surprising moment, a strange sound came from inside, a faint hiss. And then, immediately, the safe emitted a powerful spray of green paint, as if triggered by an automatic security system. A massive stream of paint shot out from the door crack, hitting Henderson square in the face and causing him to stumble back in panic. The paint poured over his face, splattering across his body and his police uniform. Henderson could do nothing but stand there, his hands flailing helplessly, trying to wipe the paint that clung tightly to his face and body. But the more he wiped, the more the paint spread, covering his face, neck, and even his arms. He now looked like a character from a sci-fi movie, with his smeared face and eyes filled with fury. Each time Henderson waved his hand to wipe it off, the paint spread even more, making him look like an amateur artist trying to create an abstract, colorful painting. "Damn it!" Henderson yelled, his eyes wide in disbelief, but there was nothing he could do to escape this absurd situation. He tried using a handkerchief to clean the paint, but the result only made things worse. The paint not only refused to come off, but it also spread further, leaving his uniform and skin covered in streaks of green. Henderson didn't know what to do. All he could do was stand there, bewildered and angry. Just as Henderson began to feel he couldn't control the situation, from a distance, another police car pulled up. Mark, Henderson's colleague, stepped out with a look of surprise. When he saw Henderson, standing in the middle of the road with his face covered in paint, he couldn't hold back his laughter. "Oh my God, Henderson!" He laughed loudly. "You look like you just stepped out of a modern art gallery." Mark quickly pulled out his phone and began recording a video. The sight before him was so absurd that he couldn't resist. Henderson's face had now turned into a colorful paint canvas, resembling someone who had been attacked with some kind of chemical weapon, but couldn't escape the mockery of his appearance. Not only Mark was recording the video, but bystanders also started stopping to watch this bizarre scene. A sedan passing by also stopped, and the driver got out, pulling out his phone while asking, "Is everything okay?" He raised his phone, adjusting the angle for the best shot, and couldn't resist mocking, "I guess he's trying out some new paint for his uniform, right?" When Henderson realized that the incident had turned into a public laughingstock, his anger intensified. He wiped his hands over his face, trying to remove the paint, but only made things worse. "This is an attack. I'm going to sue you for assault," he yelled. But the witnesses couldn't stop laughing. Mark, while recording the video, continued to tease. "Oh, Henderson, I think you need some time to relax and try a skincare treatment with that green paint." Henderson turned around, glaring at Mark, but there was nothing he could do. As soon as he turned his back, a suppressed smile from the onlookers only made him feel more humiliated. At this point, James stood aside, unable to hide the amusement in his eyes. He still maintained his calm demeanor, though inwardly he was likely finding the absurdity of the situation quite funny. Henderson looked toward James, his eyes bloodshot with anger, but he couldn't say anything. James merely repeated, "I warned you, Henderson. This safe has an extremely effective security system." Henderson glared at James in fury, his hands still futilely trying to wipe the paint off, but only failing once again. James said nothing more, just standing there, his eyes cold but not without a hint of amusement. The situation was crystal clear. Henderson could do nothing but become the laughingstock of the crowd. Laughter from the onlookers continued to ring out, and Henderson felt as though he was trapped in a snare that he had created. He yelled at James, "This is an attack! I'm going to sue you for assault!" But every word he spoke only made the crowd laugh harder. Meanwhile, Mark stood at a distance recording the video while humorously commenting, "He really can't do anything. He tries to wipe it off, but it just gets more smeared." James, with his unshakable composure, looked toward Henderson and simply replied, "Try using paint remover, but I don't think it'll work." The scene quickly became a hot topic on social media. Videos of Henderson, with his face covered in smeared paint, were shared and spread rapidly. His image became a joke for the entire online community, and the humiliation seemed to grow larger within him as everyone laughed at his expense. The scene became even more unbelievable when Henderson stepped back, still wiping the paint off his face, but nothing changed. The blue paint clung to his face and uniform, forming a thick layer that made him look more like a character in a video game than a real police officer. Henderson could no longer maintain his composure. He started shouting in a confused and panicked tone, "This is assault. I'm being attacked. He's the criminal." He pointed at James, his voice echoing as though he were the victim of some conspiracy. But as soon as Henderson's accusation left his mouth, those around him began to notice the absurdity of the situation. A few people stopped to watch, but instead of feeling concerned for a police officer being attacked, they only saw a ridiculous spectacle, with Henderson looking more like someone who had been painted than assaulted. The laughter started to echo from afar, making him even more embarrassed. A middle-aged man, who seemed to have just finished a morning jog, stopped nearby and immediately pulled out his phone to record a video. He looked at Henderson, then turned to James and remarked sarcastically, "Looks more like a paintball accident than a legitimate arrest, doesn't it?" He continued laughing and filming, adding, "Who uses blue paint to apprehend a criminal? Now that's something new." The passerby's comment caused the crowd to burst into laughter. Henderson, despite trying to maintain an air of authority, now looked like a clown in a failed performance. His stiff and stubborn actions seemed only to add to the absurdity of the situation. Henderson tried to contain his panic, but he couldn't stop his anger and humiliation. He looked around desperately, hoping for support from his colleagues or perhaps some reasonable explanation. But instead of helping, everyone seemed focused on the spectacle with mocking attitudes. "Don't touch me anymore," Henderson shouted, glaring at James as though he were the only one responsible. But James remained calm, standing there with cold, unwavering eyes. "Henderson, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just protecting my property," James responded calmly. The people around began to keep filming, some even approaching closer, holding their phones up and commenting, "What an interesting morning. Instead of pulling someone over for speeding, he gets repainted in a new color." The laughter continued, making Henderson feel more humiliated than ever. He stood there, still wiping his face, then glared at James with anger and disappointment. It seemed like everything was working against him. Just when he was at his most bewildered, a sedan suddenly stopped nearby. A driver, seemingly on his way to work, opened the door and stepped out. He saw the scene, then turned to Henderson with a surprised look. "Is everything okay, buddy?" He stared at Henderson, still fumbling with the thick layer of blue paint. Henderson, sounding exhausted, replied, trying to maintain his image, "This is an official police job. You don't need to worry about it." However, the driver was unconvinced. He just smirked, looked at Henderson, and said sarcastically, "Sounds like a paintball accident in the park to me. He probably just played paintball, not arrested a criminal, right?" Without hesitation, he kept filming, adjusting his angle to show Henderson's bewildered state, with paint all over his face. I don't know when you'll restore your normal appearance, but I think this could become the new fashion trend for police officers." The passerby's comments made Henderson feel even more embarrassed. It seemed like he had completely lost control of the situation. While the crowd kept mocking him, the laughter echoed through the air. Henderson could do nothing but turn and walk to his police car, glaring at James, muttering resentfully. This scene, though full of confusion and humiliation for Henderson, made James even more composed and confident. He knew the entire event had been recorded, and now it was just a matter of waiting for the consequences. Right at that moment, a reporter didn't hesitate to approach and ask loudly, "Can you explain why you're covered in paint, officer?" Henderson stood there, unable to respond immediately. The embarrassment and anger made him even more confused. Meanwhile, the video of this scene began to spread on social media like wildfire. People started commenting, sharing, and mocking his actions. From "green police" to "green paint investigation," thousands began to ridicule Officer Henderson and the story of him being attacked by a lawful protection system. Memes mocking the paintball cop quickly went viral, attracting countless shares, comments, and discussions. Some parody videos were posted with the title, "Henderson, the Green Man," showing footage of Henderson flailing around in anger, trying to wipe off the paint, but only making it worse, making him look even more ridiculous in the eyes of the public. At this point, the reporter continued filming, adding with sarcasm, "Looks like you're in big trouble with this property protection thing, officer. What's your next move?" Henderson shouted angrily, trying to regain his serious demeanor, but his confused expression couldn't hide the truth. Every move he made, every word he said was being recorded and spread everywhere. His reputation, his career, everything was starting to collapse under the pressure of the mocking videos and harsh comments. The people around, no longer questioning who was right or wrong, no longer saw James as a criminal, but as someone defending his legal rights against an overreaching cop. Henderson realized that not only James, but he himself was being shunned and exposed to the public. James stood still, showing no anger or frustration. He simply looked at Henderson with a cold, sharp gaze. "Maybe now you understand why I didn't cooperate with you," he said calmly. "I'm just protecting my legal rights, and I don't think I did anything wrong." A laugh echoed from the crowd. Some even started clapping, while the reporter continued filming every absurd moment of Henderson. At this point, some of Henderson's colleagues began to feel uncomfortable. They stood further away from him and started whispering to each other. They realized that their colleagues' actions had turned him into a laughingstock, not only in front of the witnesses, but also to the entire online community. As a final blow, the video recording of the entire incident quickly reached millions of views, spreading at an astonishing rate. Memes of Henderson being covered in paint began to dominate social media, making him the subject of relentless ridicule and criticism. Now, Henderson found himself in an uncontrollable situation. He realized that even if he wanted to continue chasing after James, even if he wanted to arrest him, his actions had become a huge joke in the eyes of the public. He was no longer a police officer standing for the law. He was just a figure being mocked and despised by the outside world. As Henderson struggled to wipe the sticky green paint off his face and hands, the laughter around him only made him feel more embarrassed. Suddenly, a glossy black car stopped near the scene. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with a touch of gray in his hair, but his eyes were sharp and filled with confidence. He wore an old tracksuit, but his presence was enough to attract everyone's attention. It was David Miller, an old friend of James from their time in the military. David stepped out with purpose, his eyes inevitably landing on Henderson, as if sensing the situation could escalate further. James saw David and gave a small smile. He knew that this was the one person who could clarify everything in this situation. David quickly approached James, stopping a few steps in front of him and glancing at Henderson before shifting his gaze to the safe in the car. "Hello, James," David said in a calm, steady voice, as if he didn't need to hurry. "I heard about this from some friends in the police department. I came here immediately. Are you all right?" James nodded, maintaining his composure. "I'm fine, David. Thanks for coming." David didn't waste time with pleasantries. He went straight to the point. "Looks like we're in trouble. Let me handle it." Henderson saw David arrive and began to feel uneasy. He didn't know who this man was, but the way James looked at him and the way David approached made Henderson sense something wasn't right. David moved towards the SUV, standing next to James, and began eyeing Henderson sternly. David stood upright, staring directly at Henderson before speaking. "What do you think you're doing, Henderson? Don't you realize what that safe is?" Henderson looked up, trying to regain some of the authority he had lost. "I have the right to inspect that safe. What's wrong with that?" David remained unflinching. He turned to look at James and then back at Henderson, responding bluntly. "That safe isn't just James's personal property. It contains extremely important information related to a military mission he was involved in. This mission is no small matter." David's words hit like a shock, making the atmosphere even heavier. Henderson immediately felt confused and doubtful. "What military mission?" he asked, still not fully believing. "Isn't he just a retired general? How could there be anything that important?" David didn't lose his cool. "That safe contains documents related to a special mission. If you don't understand that, you'll face the consequences. We're dealing with information that not everyone has the right to access." Henderson stiffened, but he couldn't back down. David's words made him feel uncertain, and he vaguely realized that he might have overstepped in his aggressive actions. However, in the back of his mind, Henderson still had doubts about the truth of what David said. He couldn't fathom that this safe contained such a significant secret. David continued with a stern voice. "If you intentionally damage that safe without James's permission, you're putting all of us in a dangerous situation. Don't let your doubts or personal feelings cloud your judgment. This is a matter of national security, Henderson." The tension in the air was palpable. Henderson began to realize that he might have made a grave mistake. His actions now not only threatened James, but could also lead to consequences far beyond his control. However, David's unwavering determination and refusal to compromise made Henderson hesitate to continue his reckless actions. When it dawned on him that the safe wasn't just a personal item, but contained information that could affect national security, Henderson suddenly felt embarrassed and a bit afraid. However, he still hadn't completely given up. He tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes betrayed the turmoil in his mind. David looked directly into Henderson's eyes. "Do you want to keep causing trouble, or are you going to back off right now?" At that moment, Henderson had no choice but to retreat, at least for the time being. David's presence and his strong warnings made Henderson realize that he couldn't act on impulse. However, there was still some doubt in his mind, and the confusion over what had just occurred prevented him from feeling at ease. David turned to look at James. "I'm sure you don't want this situation to escalate any further, right?" James only smiled faintly, saying nothing more. He knew everything had become clear, and now it was time to resolve the matter properly. After Henderson returned to his car and struggled to wash the green paint off his face, his anger and anxiety caused him to lose his composure. He stood still for a moment, glaring at James with eyes not only filled with anger, but also a hint of confusion. Henderson realized that all of his actions had been completely wrong. Not only had he no justification for invading James's property, but he was now facing a serious situation that could destroy his career and reputation. James showed no signs of tension. He simply stood there, watching and waiting without any concern. At that moment, he pulled a thick folder from the safe, opened it, and quickly flipped through the pages. A series of classified documents were displayed before Henderson's eyes. "These are important military documents, Henderson," James spoke calmly but with authority. "They're not just ordinary papers. They relate to a special mission I was involved in. Your invasion of my property isn't just wrong. It could have serious consequences for national security." Henderson took a step back, his face turning pale. Although he had always believed he was just following orders now, with what James had just revealed, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. He understood that if these documents truly were important and related to national security, his actions were not just a simple mistake, but could be a serious criminal offense. James looked directly into Henderson's eyes without any mercy. "Do you understand what you've just done? You opened my safe without a legal search warrant. That's not only an invasion of privacy, but could also jeopardize the safety of this country." Henderson stood there, unsure of what to say. He felt as though the world was collapsing around him. There was no longer anything to justify his actions, no reason to continue pursuing James. Henderson looked at the documents in James's hands, his eyes filled with concern. Every action he had taken now seemed like a grave mistake that couldn't be undone. "You don't have a legal reason to keep pursuing me, Henderson. I've recorded everything from start to finish," James said, his gaze unwavering. "All your actions have been documented, and you know what the consequences will be if this comes to light." Henderson stood there, unable to argue. He felt like a hunted animal with no way out. Now, he could only wait for what was coming. Punishment was certain, and it couldn't be avoided. There was no way to justify his actions anymore. He had no legal grounds to continue confronting James, no reason to maintain the tension. "So, is this the end?" James asked, his voice calm as if nothing had happened. "You can go back to work, but I'll make sure what happened won't be forgotten. I'll report the entire incident to your superiors, and if you have any conscience, you won't dare to do this again." Henderson fell silent, with nothing left to say. The shame and fear of the consequences left him speechless. All he could do now was stand there and look at James, a man he had once considered an enemy in the past, and realize that he was the one who had made the biggest mistake. While Henderson struggled with his shame, James calmly turned back to his car, unfazed. He had done the right thing, and now all he had to do was let Henderson face the consequences of his own mistakes. David, James's old military friend, also approached, giving James a gentle pat on the shoulder. "You handled this situation like a true officer," he said with an affirming smile. After Henderson drove off in anger, James did not rush to leave. He stood there for a moment, observing the change in the situation. Confident that all of Henderson's actions had been recorded, James felt a sense of satisfaction. Not only had he protected his rights, but he had also done the right thing. Justice would not be overlooked. James called the police department, reminding them that Henderson's actions needed to be addressed. He requested an internal investigation and ensured that the matter would not be swept under the rug. James knew that justice was not just about resolving this situation personally, but had to be enforced at a higher level to prevent future abuses of power. He didn't just want to protect himself. He wanted to ensure that those who exploited their authority would not be allowed to do the same to innocent people again. "Henderson violated my privacy and acted without just cause," James said to the officer on the phone. "If justice is done properly, I hope no one else has to endure this again." After ending the call, James felt content. He had done everything correctly, protected his property, and made sure that Henderson's wrongful actions wouldn't go unaddressed. Now he could continue the peaceful life he had chosen since his retirement. As James drove on, he couldn't help but look out the window and feel a sense of tranquility. Stories about this incident continued to circulate on social media. The video of Henderson and his humorous paintball debacle had gone viral, spreading at a rapid pace. Commenters continued to mock him, and people began to view this as a lesson about the abuse of power and thoughtlessness among some individuals in law enforcement. The next day, an urgent internal investigation was launched to clarify Henderson's misconduct. He was summoned to the police station to explain his actions. The meeting began with a tense atmosphere. The police chief, a stern man, couldn't hide his disappointment as he watched the videos documenting the incident. The chief demanded Henderson explain why he had interfered with James Cooper's personal property without a valid search warrant. Henderson, despite his best efforts to defend his actions, could not provide a reasonable justification. He only tried to say, "There was reason to suspect because the safe looked too special and unusual." However, these vague reasons failed to convince the investigators. Meanwhile, the police investigators began gathering evidence. They looked into James Cooper's background, a retired Army general with a distinguished career and numerous honors. They specifically verified the information regarding the safe James had with him. From James's old friends, they learned that the safe contained important documents related to a military mission James had been involved in, possibly classified materials or information related to national security. This added even more gravity to the situation, as opening the safe without permission could pose a significant danger. One crucial discovery the investigation uncovered was that Henderson had a tense history with James Cooper. They had met in the past when Henderson had been assigned to guard a military area, and there had been an unfortunate incident involving James. Perhaps it was this hostility that made Henderson more prone to make the rash decision to invade James's privacy. As the investigation deepened, it became clearer that Henderson had abused his power. He had not only violated personal property, but had also infringed upon the rights of citizens he was sworn to protect. Investigators concluded that there was no reasonable cause for Henderson's actions, and he had made a unilateral decision, ignoring procedural rules and privacy rights. After gathering enough evidence, the chief decided to suspend Henderson immediately. He was ordered to return his police badge and suspended from all duties until the conclusion of the investigation. His colleagues in the force began to criticize and mock his actions. Many of them felt embarrassed that one member of the team had caused the entire department to face public criticism. This not only affected Henderson's reputation, but also raised questions about the methods and procedures within the police department. Other members of the force began to worry that there would be changes in how police conduct and actions were monitored to prevent serious misconduct like this in the future. Everything was going downhill for Henderson. Not only had he lost face in public, but he also faced the risk of losing his career. Every step he took was now under scrutiny, and facing criticism from his colleagues was unbearable. Meanwhile, James Cooper, with his calm demeanor and support from friends, continued to protect his rights and receive backing from the community. Though he had endured unnecessary harassment, he felt satisfied that the truth had finally been exposed and justice was being served. A week later, the trial date for Henderson finally arrived. The entire city was focused on the case, and the trial took place at the local courthouse with a large presence of media, reporters, and the public. They wanted to see whether there would be justice for a police officer entrusted with upholding the law who had committed such a severe violation. Henderson entered the courtroom with a tired, anxious demeanor, his face gaunt from the days of criticism. The images from the viral video of him covered in paint were still fresh in everyone's minds, making him the laughingstock of the community. His eyes, as he entered the courtroom, betrayed his fear and despair. Though his lawyers stood beside him, Henderson knew that his situation had become very difficult. The trial began with the testimony of James Cooper. He stood up calmly and recounted the entire incident, from being stopped on the highway to the safe being violently opened. James emphasized that the safe contained important military documents and that Henderson's actions had not only violated his privacy but also breached security protocols. He explained that the safe had been designed with special protective systems to safeguard personal property and important documents, and that Henderson had no right to open it without a court order or James's permission. The evidence gathered by the investigation team was also presented, including video footage and documents proving Henderson's abuse of power. The videos of Henderson trying to wash the paint off himself were shown, adding tension to the courtroom atmosphere. James's lawyers argued that Henderson's actions were not just a violation of privacy, but also an act of brutality and abuse of power, and caused serious consequences. On the other side, Henderson's lawyers attempted to justify his actions, claiming that he had acted because of suspicions about the safe, and that his intentions were not malicious. They argued that Henderson had not fully understood the context, and had acted hastily in dealing with the situation. However, this argument did not convince the court, as the clear evidence showed that Henderson had overstepped his bounds and failed to follow proper procedures. During the closing arguments, James Cooper could not hold back his emotions. He pointed out that not only had Henderson engaged in misconduct, but there was also a serious lack of responsibility in controlling the power of the police. When the people lose trust in those who enforce justice, the entire legal system will collapse, he said, his voice choked. I just wanted to protect what's mine, and justice must be served fairly. When the trial concluded, everyone eagerly awaited the final verdict from the court. Henderson sat quietly, staring at the floor, unable to avoid the feeling of defeat. The police chief and his colleagues could not say a word. They felt ashamed to see one of their own involved in such a serious investigation. Meanwhile, James stood up, looked at the judge, and felt relieved for having spoken the truth, though he knew this was just one part of a long journey to regain justice. In the end, the court handed down a harsh sentence for Henderson after considering the full details of the case, especially his abuse of power and violation of citizens' privacy. Henderson would be permanently dismissed from the police force. Although he had been suspended earlier, the court ruled that his actions had severely damaged the reputation and transparency of the police department. Public officials, especially police officers, must be responsible for upholding the law and protecting citizens' rights. Henderson's actions, with his abuse of power and disregard for privacy, were unacceptable in law enforcement. Henderson was sentenced to probation for his abuse of power and violation of citizens' property. Although his actions had not caused physical harm, the serious violation of citizens' rights, particularly the breach of the security of important documents, required the court to take strict action. Henderson was also required to compensate James Cooper for damages related to the invasion of his personal property and the emotional distress he had endured throughout the ordeal. Although there was no direct financial harm from Henderson's actions, the court also acknowledged that his irresponsible behavior had significantly affected James's reputation and safety. To have a chance to restart, Henderson was ordered to participate in a mandatory course on professional ethics, police procedures, and conflict resolution in tense situations. Although not a severe punishment, this mandatory course showed that the court still wanted Henderson to have the opportunity to recognize his mistakes and improve himself. In addition to the punishment for this specific case, the authorities also called for an expanded investigation into any potential corruption or past misconduct by Henderson. Previous cases could be revisited if there was enough evidence, especially regarding investigations that involved Henderson's power and influence within the police force. The results of the trial quickly became a hot topic in the media and on social networks. Henderson was criticized not only for his wrongdoing, but also for his disrespect for justice and citizens' rights. Memes mocking him continued to spread, and the video of him being covered in paint remained a source of public amusement. At the same time, the case sparked a wave of criticism against the police force, with calls for the authorities to ensure that all officers acted appropriately and were held accountable for their decisions. Some civil rights organizations also called for reforms in police oversight and training procedures to avoid similar abuses of power in the future. As for James Cooper, after receiving the legal protection he needed, he returned to his peaceful life. While the events had left a mark on his life, James felt relieved to have defended his rights and witnessed justice being served. He had never wanted the situation to escalate this far, but he knew he had done the right thing and had no regrets. James did not let the incident affect his daily life. He continued with his regular activities and enjoyed the peace he had sought, although the video of Henderson's mishap continued to spread. James would just smile whenever anyone mentioned it. He had earned the respect of many in the community, especially those who had witnessed the incident and stood with justice. The story of James and Officer Henderson is not just a lesson about protecting privacy and fairness, but also a powerful testament to standing up against abuse of power and wrongdoing. Do we have enough courage to defend our rights when faced with similar situations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We look forward to hearing your opinions. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more exciting videos and dramatic stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.